Continuing to climb the bloody stairs, we will find titles and franchises that played a very important role in the development of the survival horror genre. In the previous episode of Bloody Stairs, we looked at the process of the survival horror genre, scrutinizing the influential titles and franchises along the way, and finally reached full maturity with Resident Evil. In this section, we are going to explore the titles and franchises that had a significant impact on the development of this genre and brought new experiences in the form of survival horror with their innovations. Personally, I rarely see Parasite Eve mentioned on survival horror lists, let alone named alongside its elders. But I think this game was one of the most fascinating survival horror experiences and still counts and is really underappreciated by fans of this genre. Parasite Eve was developed by Squaresoft before the merger with Enix and was released for the PlayStation 1 in 1998. What makes Parasite Eve special and different is the combination of RPG elements with the survival horror structure of Resident Evil. In the previous episode, we talked about Sweet Home and its role-playing elements, but these elements in Parasite Eve are more widely portrayed as a complete survival horror effect, which distinguishes it from other titles of its generation and even most of the works published today. As you probably know, in the 90s, Square Studio had a large portion of the market for role-playing games with Final Fantasy titles in hand, and alongside it, it also released numerous other titles such as Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana, which well named Square as one of the greats of the genre among gamers. It can be seen that the studio knew its work well in RPG, and Parasite Eve had no shortage of it. But was this consistent with the survival horror formula that Resident Evil founded? The answer is definitely yes, otherwise we wouldn't have mentioned it as one of the most influential survival horror titles. Parasite Eve contained many of the characteristics of a survival horror effect. The atmosphere and the heavy and mysterious atmosphere, lack of ammunition, and a very good soundtrack are some of the characteristics of this title, which is combined with its RPG gameplay elements. And despite the innovations and changes made in the combat system, the gameplay still conveys the familiar sense of a survival horror effect to the player. Parasite Eve also offers a more action-driven experience than Resident Evil, but it still maintains a balance between action and fear, which is a crucial pillar of a survival horror that we have seen time and time again in major franchises. On the other hand, Parasite Eve's storytelling is very attractive and depicts interesting characters, but due to the video's limitations, we are unable to deal with the details of its story. In addition to the fascinating narrative, we also saw the design of various and sometimes scary enemies and monsters that sometimes shocked the player. Finally, Parasite Eve was a very attractive, different, and creative survival horror game that had a great start to the expansion of the Resident Evil formula and transferred this interesting and different experience to its second version. Personally, I hope to see Square Enix revive the franchise in the future because it holds a unique potential, and with today's technology, developers can easily tap into that potential and create an ambitious work in the genre, because the horror genre is already desperately looking for innovation. So it comes to Silent Hill Hell on Earth, minds trapped in an endless purgatory of darkness whose weeping will never be forgotten. What a franchise! Every time I think of Silent Hill or re-experience one of its versions, I feel sad. The cruelty that Konami inflicted on the franchise and its fans was cruelty to the whole horror genre. Personally, although I love Resident Evil, I never stopped admiring Silent Hill because the franchise, despite being based on the RE formula, was itself a symbol of horror alongside Resident Evil with its original look and its deep and psychotic stories. Maybe many of them are competitors and not mistaken, but if you ask me, these two franchises, like the brothers Dante and Virgil, have always made each other thrive while constantly competing and outpacing each other. It looked at fear in a completely different way from Resident Evil. While Resident Evil used exterior elements to scare the player, Silent Hill descended into the dark, rotten depths of the human mind, evoking every fear in front of their eyes, and relying on psychological fear left no limits to creating a dark, ruthless atmosphere. Walking the streets of Silent Hill best conveyed that mysterious feeling under the player's skin and made him feel insecure. Silent Hill was never thoughtful, which is why it's considered one of the game's most terrifying works, because it was constantly trying to go further to deliver a pure survival horror experience, depicting environments that would push and challenge the player's brain like the main character. In terms of gameplay and survival elements, it followed exactly the formula of Resident Evil, but also had its own innovations. For example, you had the ability to use a wider range of weapons, including cold weapons, which made the experience a little more realistic. From kitchen knives to hammers and metal pipes, this created more ways for the player to survive, and it made a lot of sense because if you get trapped in Silent Hill, you'll use whatever is available to save you. Silent Hill, while adhering to the roots of survival horror, captured a completely different experience of fear and quickly became popular and moved shoulder to shoulder with Resident Evil for a while. But unfortunately, when Resident Evil made a fuss with its fourth version, Silent Hill 4 didn't appear in front of its fans as well as it should, and that's where the franchise went downhill. This was due to Konami's misguided management and approach to Team Silent and the Silent Hill franchise. According to Kenzie Lamar, one of the designers of Silent Hill Homecoming, Konami was the main reason for Team Silent's breakup, as the company was looking for a new touch in its games. We're all seeing the result of this new feeling. Perhaps if the franchise had been in the hands of a more committed and responsible company, today we would see an attractive competition between RE and SH, but unfortunately it didn't. However, despite the blackout of the series at the moment, its footprint is still visible in the horror genre and its psychological titles, and so the franchise can be considered as one of the key elements in the development of the horror genre. In the early 21st century, a name emerged among survival horror genres that brought one of the most unique experiences in the genre, Project Zero or Fatal Frame. In an era when we generally saw the main characters in arms struggling to survive in different ways and grappling with the devil, the work portrayed a different idea: ghosts. A very simple but different idea that had received little attention to that day. In most of the horror titles of that period, you were generally dealing with monsters or demonic creatures. But what if your enemies don't have a body? How are you going to get rid of them with your guns? If they can get through the walls and doors, how can you escape them? Fatal Frame turned all of these questions into its distinctive features. Wandering spirits that could appear in front of you at any moment and take the soul out of your body. You might open a door and meet an angry ghost, or you might see them walking through walls. As I write these things and these moments are in my mind, the overall concept of Fatal Frame was very innovative and appealing, but the question was, how do we get rid of these ghosts? Instead of guns, the creators provided the main character with an Obscura camera to take pictures of these ghosts. If you haven't played one of the franchise titles before, this structure may seem very strange, but rest assured that if you experience one of them, you'll feel perfectly aligned with survival horror gameplay. The mechanisms surrounding the combat system are much broader than they appear. Fatal Frame allows you to upgrade your camera. Also, instead of different ammo and weapons, you have different films and lenses that have different powers, some of which are better than some ghosts. In addition, as with any survival horror effect, this game has a limited amount of ammunition and does not get much easy to the player. It's not bad to go a little further away from the gameplay and get into the atmosphere of this effect. Fatal Frame, while not based on a true story, takes its patterns entirely from Japanese horror stories and legends, and that's enough to produce a scary and fascinating scenario. The atmosphere and ambience are extremely dark, eerie, and terrifying, and the stroll through the great mansion of Himuro was horrifying. You never knew when or how you would encounter the wandering ghosts of this mansion. Another thing that helped make the experience as scary as possible was the struggles. Having a gun always gives you a sense of security because you can use demons to get rid of them, but in Fatal Frame that wasn't the case. You had to look directly at the ghosts to eliminate them, and sometimes even get close to them and eyes to eyes. There were moments during this experience when the ghosts were only a few centimeters away from your face, and you had to look at their misty eyes using your camera and take pictures. The Fatal Frame franchise enjoys a lot of respect among fans of survival horror, and, in general, the horror genre, and it really brought a completely new and different idea to the genre that ultimately brought a fascinating survival horror experience in the grip of Japanese legend and culture. The next game we're going to talk about is underrated horror, Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem. The game is literally a complete survival horror experience, and I personally describe it as crazy. A work full of distinctive features and mechanisms that put Eternal Darkness far ahead of its time. Eternal Darkness lets you play 12 different characters at different time intervals and play the story forward, and this was a great feature in 2002. From the Roman gladiator in the past to the fire brigade in the present, everyone has their own personality traits. This number of playable characters has a huge impact on the variety of environments and gameplay in this effect, so that in Eternal Darkness you will experience the use of cold guns from swords to firearms such as shotgun and assault rifle. Many people think Dead Space was the first game to use amputation, but you're wrong. Eternal Darkness had this capability for years before the release of Dead Space, and those who managed to experience it today have been one of the revolutionary mechanisms of the work at the time. It should be noted that the amputation of each limb had a direct impact on the movements and how the enemies and monsters attacked. We will be able to find a variety of designs that are equally versatile and attractive. As I said, you play as 12 different characters, each living at a specific time period, which makes each have their own environment and atmosphere, which is another ambition of this Eternal Darkness. The game environment was in great detail, and each in turn depicted psychological fear that officially mocked the player's brain. One of the most prominent mechanisms in Eternal Darkness was the Sanity effect system, which had a tremendous impact on the gameplay process. When you looked at enemies and monsters, you had certain hallucinations that were sometimes wrong, and in fact, their purpose was to make the player doubt about the right or wrong things happening around them. For example, suddenly your screen shuts down and you think your TV has turned off automatically when the game is actually playing. Another of these effects that I personally like a lot comes when the player is trying to save his game, and in the process he is asked, "Do you want to delete all your save?" Here you will find any option you choose. In any case, you will encounter the message of the deleted file saved in any case. Of course, only one trick. The other side of the game is to harass the player, which officially breaks the fourth wall and, like the main characters, plays the player's brain. These were just a few of the fascinating features of this work, and I dare say that this title is one of the most special works of the horror genre to date. And it is indeed a great advance in survival horror that unfortunately was not considered as it deserved, and many people couldn't experience it at that time. And finally, Dead Space, a title that modernized the survival horror formula and implemented it perfectly. Dead Space was a sci-fi survival horror effect that had many models of Resident Evil 4. One of the most powerful parts of Dead Space is its pure, special atmosphere that best drowns and scares the player. From the moment the player enters the USG Ishimura, the game best tells him that he can't take a moment of calm for the next 8 to 7 hours. The necromorphs were designed so well that their sound matched their frightening design so that their screaming became your nightmare. Dead Space has inherited many of its features from Resident Evil 4, including a camera on the shoulder and a character buying, selling, and character upgrade. Dead Space was better than Resident Evil 4 in some parts. One of the things Dead Space did better than Resident Evil 4 was to keep the balance between fear and action, so that the two would never invade each other's territory during the game, which allowed the player to get the right dose of action and the necromorph slaughter, but, at the same time, run around in fear and sweat out of fear. As I mentioned above, this is one of the most important pillars of the creation of survival horror titles because it is easy to break the boundary between these two realms of fear and action, and this can damage the overall course of the game and the element of fear that it is trying to build. So Dead Space itself became a model for many other creators. Ambient design was also one of the other strengths of the title. The proper use of lights and shadows, along with the proper spaciousness of the game environment and its proper details, kept the player constantly on top of his guard, because he could never predict which way he was going to be attacked. You would blink for a moment, and in a few hundredths of a second, it would break through an air duct, and a necromorph would burst into you as savagely as possible. Dead Space was a breath of survival horror and offered a modern survival horror experience with as much focus on action and preserving the nature of its fear. And this performance was truly valuable and admirable in an era when the survival horror genre was stuck in modernization purgatory. Finally, we reach the top of the bloody stairs, where we see the presence of well-known or independent titles and franchises that have been modeled and climbed the stairs that these titles had built along the way to the evolution and development of the survival horror genre and displayed their works on the big stage of the gaming industry so that they could be a stepping stone for their future development.